Cathyrn Chatburn, I think, will paint for us a vision of how our urban environments might be. And of course, as George reminds us, there are multiple futures. And so thinking positive, I think, is interesting. And I'll also introduce Mark, who is here at QUT now. Mark is a director of the board of Green Cross Australia, which I'm eternally grateful for, and previously was the Director of Infrastructure at AECOM, so very, very big thinker around, the major challenges and solutions ahead. Cathryn.
So first slide, please. I'm going to dive in. I've got 7 minutes, so the slide's incorrect and my time frame's been shortened to pretty much, my brief is very much to explore with you possibilities of Brisbane in 2036, the future idea of a city as a whole. To do this, I very much cast the net as broadly as I could because there is so much fantastic work and thinking going on, not only in Queensland and not only in Australia, but across the world. So this presentation, I think it's important to say, is very much a reflection of a lot of trends and themes that are being reflected across the world as cities and countries deal with the issue of climate change, flood, and whether that flood is related to catchment or sea level rise. So, and I'm supposed to encourage bold thinking, so hopefully I will do that. Next slide, please. So, bold thinking requires vision. How bold is our vision? And I'm just going to very briefly quote a great hero of mine. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So, and this is thinking from the past, but very, very important, I think, from my perspective on now. This is an image of a piece of work that I've done recently for Curtin University, where they're completely rethinking 2 paleo channels, which run through their campus, 114 hectares, and looking at them very much as being important pieces of their green infrastructure for their future growth. Next slide, please. One of the important things about vision as well, I think, is particularly the city scale. I wanted to show this. I mean, you've seen a slide of this already, and hopefully I pronounce it correctly. Chongqing, I think, is the correct pronunciation. So this is Seoul. The significance of the scale of change that can be achieved at a city scale is incredible. So big visions don't require 10 years, 20 years. Big visions can be realized in quite human scale timeframes. This project is incredible in terms of some of the outcomes. Biodiversity increase, reduction in urban heat island, dealt with a road corridor that was carrying 100,000 vehicles through the city. I encourage you very much to have a look at this as a possibility of what can be done in only sort of 3 to 5 years within a city context. And for me, that's important for everyone in the room and today in terms of what we could possibly achieve. Next slide, please. For me, the issue of flood in Brisbane, we have a very intimate relationship with our river. We are the river city. For me, always, it's good to reflect on what things mean, really. And I often go back to dictionaries and meanings of words. And for me, this was interesting just in terms of changing our perspective and our relationship with our river as not a corridor that carries water, but the hinterland and the edges of the river as well. So this for me was quite sort of valuable, and I think, again, in rethinking, reimagining our relationship with the river, reconnecting with an idea that is not just about something that we're on the edge of, but something that we are very much a part of. Next slide, please. So this is Brisbane, only maybe 100 years ago. These are turn-of-the-century postcards from the State Library, and this is North Quay, and this is an area of Brisbane that's set to change incredibly again in the next 5 to 10 years. And in terms of, again, this issue of relationship, the things that are going on here, and the intimacy of the adjacent city to the river and the life on the river is really key. Next slide. Our current, sorry, go back. Sorry. So the next slide was talking about our current life. So again, just thinking about how we are, how we use the river at the moment as a city, as a community. We travel. Do we travel enough on the river? Some people are fed by the river. I've seen many people an increase in fishing. in the river, which has been quite interesting. We're inspired by it, but we're definitely, I think, probably based on recent events, quite intimidated by it, maybe. It's a source of comfort in terms of urbanization and increased heat island effect and a need and a diminishing of green. It's very much a source of climate comfort with the trees that line its banks. We play on the river. Could we play more? And like I said, Brisbane is the river city. It is very much a key piece of our identity, and we use it very much to express our identity as a city. Next slide. So, River City 2036. Where do we go? This photo actually, interestingly, was 10 years ago. And again, just this issue of how much can change in a city context. Where we are now, these buildings obviously did not exist. Next slide. This is a very similar piece of the river. This is a model that was done as part of a G20 exercise. And this is our children's view of our future city. Which for me, the incredible things I take from this is the amount of interaction and the relationship between the two banks that the children are seeing as really key pieces of the future city. We're not retreating from it. They see it still as being a very important part and contained within the city, not dividing the city. Next slide, please. So I'm going to explore, as part of this idea of what is the future city, I think probably 3 key themes. The notion of city as catchment is not a new one. It's very much being discussed by many people all over the globe, and particularly in Australia. Next slide, please. And the city as catchment for me as an idea is that we look at our urban footprint and we actually respond to the natural rhythms of our city to create a new city footprint. And believe me, I know that's quite a big sort of challenge in terms of change, but I think it's an interesting one to explore. Our city-scale strategies are responsive to the catchment character, both physically and seasonally. You know, sort of how much infrastructure do we actually build in terms of people's day-to-day lives that reflect that seasonal variation? And when we do have those peaks, we know, there are summer peaks in the water catchment, there are tidal peaks in the water catchment, and that our urban footprint maybe is more of an elastic edge. And everybody understands that elastic edge of the urban footprint. It's not sort of, they're not, maybe we change the neighborhood boundaries to respond to that sort of the elasticity of the creeks and the river corridor, and not sort of geographic and political boundaries that we've created before. And three strategies guide this evolution. The idea of defend, obviously. Can you, next slide, please? The idea of defend, where we have value and where it's very difficult to change. These images show sort of examples that are being explored all over the world. The Dutch example there, with the Bund, which is being inhabited. And then the sketch is an idea that was put forward for a competition that San Francisco ran in 2009. But we recognize that there are certain parts of the city that are too valuable to remove, sort of rethink, so we must defend them. We adapt, and already today the speakers have spoken about the flood of ideas. So a couple of these images I've taken from the flood of ideas, just in terms of people rethinking how we live and rethinking the models of residential and infrastructure within a flood catchment. And then how about in those areas where the flood issue and the impact over time we know is so extreme, maybe we just need to rethink how we use that land and reconsider it. Why do the same thing over and over again? As was just said, if it's happened before, it'll happen again. So maybe there's an opportunity to rethink what we do. And with urbanization, maybe the sort of urban agriculture, creating a place that is closer to our urban centres, which are increasing, to actually have agriculture, which might respond then to the flood cycles. Or maybe carbon sinks, if the carbon credits sort of start to emerge again. Next slide, please. Second idea, the contributory city. So this is very much where we actually think of all of the elements of the city as a holistic piece of a system. And every aspect of the street, the building, is considered as a whole. and it sort of contributes to the way we manage water, the way we recycle water, and the way we create habitats that are actually comfortable in extreme heat as a result of the design that's required to carry volumes of water when we need them to. Next slide, please. The final stream, sorry, no pun intended, of the thinking is the idea of, and again, this is just a synthesis of a lot of material that is being explored. Communities, individuals, governments are very much sort of thinking about all this stuff. But the idea of really elevating the role of the creek catchments as identity of communities, and maybe a collector of communities. And this in particular for me could be key when we're having to deal with extreme events as well, that you've actually got an established community that understands its creek and its water catchment better as a result of all this incredible data that we now increasingly have access to. So the community aren't surprised, and the community support each other and know how to support each other in the future. Also, maybe district systems, maybe a more resilient structure for a community within these creeks is actually a district system where we're not sort of reliant on power or infrastructure from sort of further afield, which we might be cut off from. And then also, memory is so important. People forget very quickly the things that have happened in the past, and we wondered whether these are ideas. Again, I've spoken to many colleagues about sort of different things they would do, but maybe the Festival of the River is as much about sort of understanding the seasonal and annual changes in that river so that we as a community are far more familiar. We've rebuilt our relationship on an intimate level with the river. And as a final thought, next slide please. Back to the gentleman I quoted to begin with, Mr. Buckminster Fuller. I think today, this for me is a really sort of powerful statement for today in terms of an opportunity to really sort of have a look at what we're doing and really reimagine, is there an opportunity to ask new questions and imagine new things? Next slide, please. Discuss. I'll hand over to Mark. Thank you.
Okay, so Cathryn set a really nice vision about how we could have this future in 2036. I'm going to be, I guess, a little bit of the bad cop and talk about some of the barriers, some of the things we need to overcome to get there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the Inundation Trap. Ecologists in the room will know this as an ecological trap. Really, why are smart people attracted to do houses in locations at risk? Because since 2011, we've actually, in Brisbane, I have to be a little bit careful here, I don't think BCC's, anyway, we've actually put more houses at risk in the Brisbane catchment. Okay, the other way to think about this, why is it so hard to implement the things we need to do to achieve Cathryn's vision? Okay, next slide please. Okay, it wasn't always like this. Now, for a lot of recent history for Australia and Queensland and Brisbane and a lot of other places in the world, the houses, the structures that are most at risk were the people who worked on the rivers, fishermen, coastal people who worked there. They were certainly not the wealthy parts of our community. In Australia, if you want to find the wealthiest real estate in Australia, just measure how far away it is from the coast or the river, pretty much. That's new. That's only happened really since World War II. And a couple of images here. The top image is something that was really common around Brisbane River 100 years ago. This obviously, so I actually think these are holiday houses. That's not Queensland. And I found this one, which I've really no idea what that is, but anyway, it's just a really interesting, I don't know, there's some sort of floating changing room. Anyway, whatever. Anyway, okay, next slide, please. Okay, now I think there's three reasons for this, and they're actually pretty well known, but we still struggle with them. There's a sense of security of people, we build our houses right on the river or right on the coast. There's a sense of security that we're going to be all right, which is often misplaced. There's still perverse incentives in the system, and there's this ability to transfer risk. So what we do in our day-to-day lives is what we mostly do is actually try and transfer risk to other people. That's what we do every day. Okay, so we'll talk about the first one, the sense of security. Right, these are some typical flood maps that you see. These ones are supplied by my colleague Joe Chapman from ACOM in US, so it's in feet, so sorry, that's why. When we're planning, as a home builder or as a consumer or as a buyer, when we're planning where we're going to live in terms of near a waterway, we'll often see these maps now. Fortunately, they're a lot more common than they used to be. The red line on here is what we call in Queensland, we call a Q100 line. This is a line where on average 1 in 100 year event would get up to. So the waterways on the top left hand here, and this is all developed area. So there's just a widespread general perception in the community still that if you live on the right hand side of that red line, you will never get flooded, which is not true. And if you live to the left of that red line, you might get flooded every 100 years. And I hope nobody believes that. But anyway, if you do, you need to come and have a chat to me. This is still widespread in the community. And yeah, it's a good Tony here. It's still widespread in the community. That's wrong. So I'll just run you through a couple of things. If you're on the right of that red line, this is only the 1 in 100 event. You can still get flooded by a 1 in 200 year event, 1 in 300 year event, 1 in 400 year event, 1 in 500. There's plenty of events that will still result in you being flooded. Okay, in the circle there where it says 4.7 feet, so if it's on average 1 in 100 year event, which obviously can happen once every 30 years at times, it does. In that event, your house is underwater by nearly 5 feet. Okay, next slide please. This is a 1 in 50 year event, so this is a different event, right? It's not the same one, it's a different event. Your same house is still flooded by 4 feet. Okay, next one please. 1 in 25 year events, a completely different event. You're still getting flooded by 3 feet. These are different events. Next one please. 1 in 10 year flood in that house there, which is only just a block inside the red Q100 line, you are being flooded by 1.5 feet. These are different events, remember? Okay, next one please. So if you live in that house there, on average, although you're just inside the Q100 line, on average every year there's a 10% likelihood that you're going to get flooded. Although you're just inside the Q100 line. All right, let's go to the next one. Average length of a home mortgage in Australia and the US at the moment is 30 years. The likelihood that even if you're on that Q100 line, the likelihood that you're going to get flooded while you are in the house is 1 in 4. If you're just inside that line, the likelihood that you're going to get flooded during the time of your mortgage is almost a certainty. It can't obviously be a certainty, but it's pretty much a certainty that you'll get flooded at least once, if not many, many times. And you're only a block in from the Q100 line. So that information is not widely understood out there in the general public. Okay. So the first reason is there's this sense of security. People see a flood map with a Q100 on it and they think, if I'm outside it, I'm right. If I'm inside it, I might get flooded. And I'll give you a little story about this. After the 2011 floods, I was riding into work and it was a talkback show and somebody came on and they said, we bought a house on the edge of the Oxley Creek that was flooded, and the presenter said, did you know about the flood risk? And they said, yeah, we looked at it carefully. We knew we were inside the Q100 line. We understood what that meant. We knew that we just bought the house, therefore in 99.5 years that house would be flooded. We thought we're only going to be there for 20 years. We're right. And I was riding and I nearly fell off my bike. At the time I was leading the flood management group at ACOM, and I went and I said to the guys, I've just heard this, and they said, I don't believe you. And I said, that's what a homeowner has just said. And that is still widespread out in the community. Okay, so we've got to fix that, right? We've got to fix that. Okay, next one. Okay, incentives. There's still perverse incentives. So if you're the family, you're buying a house, even though you may not be there for 30 years, taking on a 30-year mortgage, before you transfer that risk out, you're wearing that risk, right? The flooding, you are wearing that risk. You get advice from people, and there are a number of stakeholders and actors who are determining what that risk will look like. You talk to real estate. I know my local real estate agents quite well. They are very happy to tell prospective homeowners, I live at Wynnum, that if they buy a house right on the waterfront, they're in the Q100 line, and which means they might get over 100 period they might get inundated. Okay. These guys, and I'm not trying to throw rocks here, but these guys, they're involved in that risk for about 8 weeks, and that's a transaction of a property. That's the length of time that they're involved with that risk. I'll leave the next one for a second. Property developers, we work a lot of property developers. They try and get in and out in 2 years' time, right? Buy a place, develop it, turn it into a block of flats, get out 2 years' time. They're exposed to that risk for 2 years. Public office, a lot of decisions around how we develop and the planning in terms of land use planning are ultimately signed off, for example, by councillors. 3-year term, 3-year terms, maybe 6, maybe 9 years, and our elected official's not here, I assume there's no more. But anyway, still a short period of time compared to, for example, 30-year mortgage. The timeline, the incentives around the timelines mean that all the people as a homeowner I'm listening to and are telling me where and where I can't live are incentivised over much shorter risk timescales than I'm wearing. So there's some interesting perverse incentives in there. Okay, and just finally, around risk. Next slide, please, sorry. Okay, so as I said at the start, that's what we do. We transfer risk to others. How do we transfer flood risk from our properties? How do we transfer that to somebody else? We buy insurance, right? In Australia, there's a widespread perception that house insurance is a right. I, as a homeowner, have a right to get house insurance. That is absolutely not the case, and my colleagues in Suncorp, I'm trying to find them, will quite happily tell me that is not the case. It is not the case. It is a privilege. How do insurers manage this risk? They annualise it. My house insurance is on an annual basis. What happens when we get a couple of significant events in a row? What happens to our insurance premiums? They go up. North Queensland, great example. Because they have to, because insurance companies, and we forget this, are a legitimate profit-making business. It's not a social service. It is a legitimate private business that we can participate in. It is not a right. Insurance companies manage it by annualising the policy. So there's been some surveys done of new residents in Chelmer after the floods that have been done late last year, and if you read them, the people have bought into Chelmer and they all say, yep, I've done my homework, I've got flood insurance. What they haven't thought about, they've got flood insurance which might cover them for the next flood, but they haven't thought about what's going to get after that, because insurers have every right to not insure somewhere, and we've seen that in Queensland, Roma, Emerald, all the rest of it. So there's some real things in our system which are still incentivising us to take more risks than perhaps we need to, and that's a barrier to achieving Cathryn's vision in 2036.
Woo, 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 woo. Come on up, Cathryn. So there is an inquiry in North Queensland now where we are contemplating becoming American in the sense of subsidising the general insurance pool, which means your taxes will subsidise that funny little set of incentives about who profits in the short term. And just a gentle reminder, yes, Blair said, highly unlikely we'll get a cyclone here in southeast Queensland 20 years from now. Munich Re has been on the record for many years that SEQ is the highest cyclone risk pretty much in all of Australia. They are just waiting for us to cop what happened in the 60s again. Okay, do we have questions? This is a wonderful group. I know who you are in the audience. Everyone's shy. Dorian Erhart, I'm looking at you. Don't be shy. I have a question for you. Dorian, of course, is with LGAQ. And I'm thinking in 2036, if we're at Cathryn's wonderful vision, then something has changed in how we do land use planning. It's a lot more flexible, collaborative, intelligent, with opportunities to rethink. What's happened to get us there, Dorian?
Okay, thanks for that, Mara. I was actually busily making some notes while Mark was speaking, because I do think about these sorts of things on a fairly regular basis. And what has happened to allow that to occur between now and 2036, is that we as a community, as a planning community in particular, have evolved or developed new tools for being able to express risk and hazard in planning schemes, for being able to allow time-limited developments to occur, for example, so that you don't have to, as of today, sterilise a site because it may be in a hazard area sometime between now and 2100. That you have flexible arrangements with different types of land uses, and of course building standards have changed to respond to those more flexible arrangements as well. I made a particular note about Mark's point with regards to, the percentage probability of annual flooding. So where I've been able to talk to planners, I've been saying you really have to stop using a hard line on a map to define hazard, because it's not representative of the reality. You gave me a brilliant idea about with your slide there, so I think I'm going to talk about that with more people over time as well.
Okay, very good. I can see shyness in the audience. I know you're brilliant, and you probably are thinking about things. I had a thought, which I'll pose to our friends at the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, without naming anyone, because I know there's a crew here. And I'm going to pose it to Mark as well, and Cathryn. I think suddenly it occurred to me, here's how Melbourne does things, right? The way they're going to turn Elizabeth Street into a creek is because a super cool designer who thought of the laneway economy 15 years ago and started doing cartoons about it, wrote an article in The Age in March and designed what it will look like, and all the happy small businesses and all the people who are wondering. And there's been 386 blogs on that article in The Age, and they're now at the stage of working out what they named the creek, right? So the question I had is, should we have a construction authority instead of a reconstruction authority? Should we have the capacity to think with foresight about how we flex and make ourselves more flexible and begin to take these bold steps instead of waiting to get hammered and then do it? What do we think? And please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Brendan Moon from the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. The general observation I would make is that I think we're at a particularly sweet spot in terms of what policymakers are considering and contemplating at this particular point in time. If we look since 2011, we've invested roughly $13 billion in the reconstruction of Queensland in the aftermath of floods, and that's been a joint Commonwealth and state and local investment. And quite rightly, the community are looking at us and they're asking, what have you done to make it safer for us in the event of future events? Also coalescing with that is that we have this renewed focus on the climate change discussion. So they're also looking at, okay, then how are we going to incorporate that when we reconstruct after an event? How are we incorporating those additional challenges in the way we reconstruct? And Mark, I come back to your point. What are the policy levers? What are the indicators, or what's driving us in terms of our investment and decision-making process? And currently, we are having a discussion with the Commonwealth. Is that why are we investing or reinvesting 90% of the funds in just putting it back in the same place, in the same manner in which it was originally constructed? Why aren't we looking at additional investment in resilience funding or making it better? And I know we will speak more clearly and more definitively about this later on this afternoon. But I think we're at this peculiar spot in time where we can influence that debate. Now we have, for example, in our organisation, mountains of data that we can demonstrate that if we just put it back in the same place and invest the same sort of money, it is at risk into the future. What we need to do is to harness that data and the power that that data represents, and to make the case now for Department of Finance, for example, because they are ultimately the drivers of the policy here, that if we are going to be sensible about reinvestment following a disaster, we need to take into account what the benefits are of investment in resilience now. It's not confined to a budget cycle. This should be a long 30-year time frame.
What response can I have to that apart from fantastic? Because, if it, without being too critical, if you look at our response from Brisbane from the 2011 floods to save New York after Cyclone Sandy. I know New York has a lot more resources, all the rest of it, but it actually just seems to me chalk and cheese, to be really blunt about it. If you want to see what New York's done, it's all available on the web. There's some fantastic stuff there about the design competition they have, the sort of things that they're changing. Absolutely fundamentally game changer for New York. And the recognition was there because of, particularly obviously around Manhattan, but it was great in New York, was we just can't have this sort of damage. I'll be a little bit careful here, and we made some changes to the minimum floor levels around Brisbane, which in my area has resulted in more houses being built on the side of creeks, more houses at risk, which is kind of interesting. We spend a huge amount of money on public infrastructure, but of course the whole betterment debate that we had then was pretty unsatisfactory. And I understand why, the political context there, absolutely. But especially when you see a bridge being rebuilt after 2011, again completely washed away in 2013, you're thinking, well, that wasn't a great use of my taxpayer money.
As a segue, I guess, to Cathryn, we imagine, we're going to be deficit funded in Australia now for quite some time. We understand that. It is not a time of ample cash flow. And yet, with deficit funding, we know we're going to invest in infrastructure, right? How do we loosen up our thinking to align this adaptive resilience infrastructure to the big infrastructure spend that's happening on roads and airports and everything else, right? And I'm very interested in how much our Prime Minister gets this. So Malcolm and Lucy come as a duo, and it's not coincidental that she is doing the metropolitan scale strategy in Sydney. And he recently shared with us that part of urban design is a massive investment in green infrastructure. So Cathryn, how can we in Brisbane and Southeast Queensland and all of Queensland understand that this is not airy-fairy stuff, that there is a value to natural capital?
Wow, okay. I think a significant, the last piece of what I presented, which is actually about community, I think having very sort of real conversations with communities. I've done work with a community on one of the creeks, and they're actually very, very intimately, sort of groups are very intimately connected to the places where they live. And significantly, when they've lived there a long time, I think this issue of how long people have lived in places, and I think facilitating a conversation that starts at both ends of the spectrum, where the community start to understand how small moves and their relationship with their creek, their catchment, and their ability to be part of shaping their relationship with their creek and catchment is really valuable. And then helping people understand there's a very new way of thinking, and it's not new. I mean, let's face facts. We know how to do this. There are examples all over Australia, all over the world of, in inverted commas, green infrastructure. City infrastructure that delivers multiple benefits. It's not just a road, it's a climate comfort, it's a water catchment. And we deliver projects, but maybe we need to, again, sort of at both ends of the spectrum, at the political end of the spectrum, and it's quite interesting to see the dialogue at a federal level at the moment. Really starting to set briefs for our infrastructure and what we spend on that expect more from our spending. And for me, I'm always surprised when spending in infrastructure just delivers one thing. When you can see all of the multitude of opportunities that could be delivered if a broader brief was set for it and a holistic approach, a collaborative approach. The issue that was, the approach that was cited at the start of this session about collaboration, and collective minds coming together that put all of the opportunity and all of the solutions into what we're delivering in cities, I think is key. If that makes sense.
Thank you both.